When I married Paul, I anticipated that becoming a stepmother to his teenage son Chris would be difficult. At 19, Chris was nearly an adult, and I was in my mid-30s. The age difference wasn't huge, but it still made me feel cautious, especially given the messy circumstances surrounding his parents' divorce. Initially, Chris was polite but kept his distance. I made attempts to engage him through casual conversation and activities, but he stayed reserved. With Paul often working long hours, Chris and I were left alone at home, which only heightened the awkwardness. I didn't want to push too much, so I gave him space, hoping that eventually he would warm up to me. One rainy afternoon, the house felt especially empty, so I decided to bake cookies. The warm, inviting scent soon filled the kitchen, and Chris, drawn to it, came in. "Those smell good," he said, leaning against the counter. "Do you want to help?" I asked, handing him a spoon. To my surprise, he agreed. We spent the next hour chatting about his plans for college, favourite films, and memories from his childhood. For the first time, he seemed comfortable, and we even shared a laugh. I felt a small sense of achievement in the connection we had made. From that day forward, things between us began to change. Chris started spending more time with me in the kitchen, lingering over conversations that stretched late into the night. We spoke about everything: his frustrations with his father's absence, the struggles stemming from his parents' separation, and his uncertain future. I listened, offering support and encouragement. Our relationship deepened, and it felt like we were finally becoming a family. But as time passed, I began to notice a subtle shift. Our talks became more personal, and there was an unspoken tension that left me uneasy. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself that it was all in my head. After all, I was his stepmother, and he just needed someone to confide in. One evening, while we were watching a movie together on the couch, I sensed a change in the atmosphere. Our shoulders brushed, and I became overly aware of his presence. It was just a brief moment, but it left me feeling strangely uneasy, a feeling that lingered. The more time we spent together, the more conflicted I felt. I enjoyed his company, maybe more than I should have. I reassured myself that it was just a natural bond forming, but part of me questioned if it was something deeper. One night, while sipping hot chocolate in the kitchen, Chris looked at me with a look that took me by surprise. "I'm really glad you're here," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since I felt like I could talk to someone." His words seemed innocent enough, but the way he spoke made my heart race. I forced a smile, trying to push down the confusing feelings rising inside me. "I'm glad too, Chris. I want you to feel like you can talk to me about anything." Deep inside, I knew things were getting complicated. I was his stepmother, and I loved his father. I couldn't allow myself to let the boundaries blur. Still, the bond we'd developed felt dangerously close to something I wasn't ready to face, and I worried that I was already too far in to turn back. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my distance, hoping that it would help me sort out my emotions. I kept myself busy with hobbies and outings, anything to avoid being alone with him for too long. But whenever I came home, it felt like the air between us pulled me back in. He had a way of engaging me in conversation that made me forget the boundaries I needed to maintain. One afternoon, while I was flipping through TV channels, Chris came in looking drained. He dropped his backpack and flopped onto the couch next to me. "Rough day?" I asked casually. "Yeah, really rough," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, frustration clear in his voice. "Do you want to talk about it?" I offered, unsure if I should. My efforts to keep some distance were already faltering. After a moment of hesitation, he began to vent about a tough project, a demanding professor, and the pressure he was under to succeed. As I listened, I found myself slipping back into my familiar role of providing comfort and support. "You know you're doing great, right?" I said, trying to lift his spirits. "College is tough, but you're tougher." He smiled, a small, thankful smile that made something inside me stir. "Thanks. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words hit harder than I expected, and once again I felt the line between us blurring. I quickly stood up, needing space. "I think I'll make some tea," I mumbled, my voice shaky. Chris looked at me confused but didn't say anything. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I filled the kettle. Why was this happening? Why did I feel so conflicted around him? He was my stepson, and I needed to keep things simple. The sound of the kettle's whistle broke my spiraling thoughts, and I poured myself a cup, trying to calm my racing heart. Moments later, Chris came into the kitchen, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," I lied, avoiding his gaze. "Just a little tired." He didn't press, but his concern was evident, and I felt guilty for involving him in my confusion. I knew I needed to find a way to manage this to keep things from escalating, but every time we were alone, the tension between us seemed to grow. That night, I decided I would talk to Paul, hoping he could help me figure this out. But when he came home, tired and distracted, I couldn't bring myself to add to his stress. He gave me a quick kiss and retreated to his office, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to the faint sounds of music from Chris's room. I was torn, not sure whether I should check on him or keep my distance. In the end, I stayed in the kitchen, gripping my cup of tea and wondering how things had become so complicated. The tension between Chris and me was becoming unbearable. I tried to stay busy, avoiding being alone with him, but it seemed like the more I tried, the more we were drawn together. Every glance, every word felt charged with something unspoken. I knew I had to maintain boundaries, but it was getting harder each day. One evening, Paul called to let me know he'd be working late again, which had become a familiar pattern, leaving Chris and me alone more often than I liked. I decided to cook dinner, hoping it would keep my mind off the growing unease. As I stirred a pot of pasta, Chris came into the kitchen, making the room feel smaller. "Smells great," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. I focused on the food, but I could feel his gaze on me, making my pulse quicken. "Do you ever get tired of this?" he suddenly asked. I looked up, puzzled. "Of what?" I asked. "Being alone," he clarified. "It's always just us. Doesn't it bother you?" His question caught me off guard. I shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It's just how things are. Paul works hard, and I'm used to it." Chris frowned and shook his head. "But you shouldn't have to be. You deserve more than just being alone all the time." His words hit me hard, and I felt my chest tighten. I turned back to the stove, trying to hide the emotions stirring inside me. "Marriage isn't always perfect, Chris," I said. "There are compromises." "I know, but it's not fair to you," he said softly. The silence that followed was thick with an unspoken emotion. I felt him step closer, and I knew I should say something to break the tension, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding. "Chris, we can't—" I began, my voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said, his eyes locking with mine, "but it's hard when you're the only one who makes me feel this way." My breath caught in my throat. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that frightened me. I stepped back, desperate to create some distance. "This isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't do this." "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking torn. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "No, it's not your fault," I quickly replied. "We're both just confused." He nodded, but the look in his eyes wasn't just confusion. It was longing, a reflection of the turmoil I felt inside. I turned away, pretending to be busy with the food. My hands were trembling as I tried to steady myself. Dinner was a quiet, strained affair. We barely spoke, both lost in our thoughts. The tension between us was palpable, a barrier we knew we couldn't cross, but one we couldn't ignore either. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to escape my thoughts. But lying in the dark, all I could see was the look in his eyes, the intensity of that moment. I knew I needed to end this before something happened that we couldn't undo, but I wasn't sure I could. The following days were unbearable. I avoided Chris, keeping myself busy with errands and chores, trying to ignore the weight of what had almost happened. But every quiet moment reminded me of the tension that lingered between us. Paul's announcement that he would be away on a business trip over the weekend filled me with dread. The thought of being alone with Chris for 3 days felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a safety net. The first day was manageable. We barely spoke, each of us staying in our own part of the house. But by the second evening, the silence was suffocating. I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. We needed to confront what was happening. "Chris, we need to talk," I said. finding him in the living room. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. He looked up, surprise and exhaustion in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "This thing between us, it has to stop. We can't keep pretending it's not there." He looked away, his expression tight. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not that easy." "I know it's not," I said, my voice softening. "But we have to be honest with ourselves. This isn't healthy. You're my stepson, and I'm married to your father. We can't let this mess everything up." Chris stood up, frustration evident in his posture. "So what are you saying? That I should just forget how I feel?" "It's not about forgetting," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "It's about doing what's right. You're going through a tough time, and maybe I've gotten too close, but we can't let this go any further." His eyes were filled with pain as he looked at me. "You think this is just a phase, that I'm confused?" "No," I said, shaking my head, "but I think what we feel is complicated by everything else. It's not real, Chris. Not in the way you think." He took a step closer, his voice breaking. "But it feels real to me. You're the only one who understands me, who cares." Tears welled in my eyes. I wanted to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't. "I care about you too, but not like this. We can't do this. It's wrong, and we both know it." He nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek. "So what now? We just pretend none of this happened?" "Yes," I whispered, my heart breaking. We have to. We have to move on." There was a long silence filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Chris nodded, his face etched with hurt. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll try." He turned and walked away, and I felt a pang of loss, so deep it almost took my breath away. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his door closing upstairs, feeling like I had lost something precious. The rest of the weekend passed in strained silence. When Paul returned, I threw myself into the routine of daily life, pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Chris and I had come too close to crossing a line we could never return from. Even though we had pulled back, the damage was done. We had broken something between us that could never be fixed, and I knew we would both carry the scars of this moment forever, even if no one else ever knew.